The 2008 U.S. presidential election saw a pretty one-sided victory for the Obama campaign, which would have 2 terms in the White House and had very lasting impacts on the United States and the world, as the 8-year period from 2009 to 2017 would be a very turbulent time. But what if, in an alternate timeline, John McCain was able to defeat Barack Obama in the 2008 U.S. presidential election? But first, a couple of minutes of context. John S. McCain III was born in the Panama Canal Zone in 1936, where political opponents in 2008 would claim that he didn't qualify to become president due to not being born on American soil. However, the canal was a U.S. territory at the time, plus his father was an officer in the United States Navy. Anyway, McCain would also serve as a pilot in the Vietnam War, where he was shot down and captured by the North Vietnamese. McCain would also be brutally tortured by the communists for years before being released in 1973. After his release and vigorously supporting Ronald Reagan's 1976 presidential campaign, McCain left the Navy and would enter the political theater, where he was an Arizona congressman from 1983 to 1987 and a senator from 1987 to 2018. McCain would also be considered as a vice presidential running mate several times, being in 1988 for George H.W. Bush, in 1996 for Bob Dole, in 2000 for George W. Bush, and even in 2004 by Democrat John Kerry. However, none of these vice presidential opportunities would occur. In 2000, John McCain would run for the president in the Republican primaries, but would be defeated in a very nasty primary and end up endorsing Texas Governor George W. Bush, who won the nomination for the presidency, and eventually won the election. From 2000 to 2008, McCain supported most of President Bush's actions as president and was a hawk on the war on terror, as well as a staunch supporter of the war in Iraq, and would constantly go to the country to get the most accurate picture of the war, which is more than most Congress members or senators would do. He was also a maverick on the domestic front, where he supported some Democrat positions in a bipartisan manner. However, McCain would win the 2008 Republican nomination against all odds and surprising many. During his campaign, McCain would face a very uphill battle against the Barack Obama campaign, and although he would come close at times to achieving an underdog victory, Obama would win in a landslide election. There were various elements which were out of McCain's control, which inherently hurt his campaign, such as McCain's older age compared to Obama's youth, and of course the Great Recession hitting while McCain was part of the incumbent party. Of course, another aspect McCain couldn't control, which would have helped him out, would be if Obama lost the Democrat nomination to Hillary Clinton, who was not near as charismatic as Obama and had a lot of scandals to do attacking with. Turning to what he could control, a big mistake McCain had was saying that the fundamentals of the economy were strong when the recession hit, and that gave Obama a ton of ammunition for attacks. But one major condition that was in McCain's realm of control is his vice presidential selection. In our timeline, McCain selected Sarah Palin, who was far from the best choice. She was initially chosen as a game-changer choice to counter Obama's star status and his rhetoric of change. Although Palin was initially very well received for her conservative positions and the ability to invigorate crowds off-book, she would prove to be a very poor choice due to her lack of foreign policy knowledge, routine gaffes where she was unable to answer questions, and of course her sometimes bizarre statements. McCain had originally wanted to have his friend Joe Lieberman, a former Democrat turned independent, to be his running mate to show that he would be a president for all Americans and double down on his bipartisan maverick reputation, as well as his stances on the war on terror. However, the conservative base was already skeptical about McCain's record in Congress and the Senate, as well as having Lieberman on the ticket would undoubtedly cause a walkout from the Republican National Convention by more conservative elements like Mike Huckabee. Although conservatives would be disheartened and a good bit would protest vote for the Libertarian Party, Lieberman's selection would gain more ground for McCain from independents in crucial battleground states up north and in the Midwest, who were turned off by Obama being from the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. So I feel like the loss of core support for McCain would be negated by his support that he would bring from independents. Regardless, in McCain's memoirs in 2018, he said that his gut told him to pick Lieberman, and he wished that he could have chosen Lieberman instead of Palin. Another potential running mate for McCain is Tom Ridge, the former Pennsylvania governor, first Secretary of Homeland Security, and fellow Vietnam vet. Now, Ridge was considered for McCain's running mate due to his tough-on-crime stance and very warm personality, which stood in stark contrast to both Dick Cheney and Joe Biden. But he was passed over by McCain due to some liberal stances on social issues, despite invigorating most of the conservative base. With him on the ticket, McCain would not have a conservative walkout, but sure, he would lose some support among hardcore conservatives, yet he would bring in more moderate and independents than he would lose. Condoleezza Rice is another choice who had been Bush's national security advisor in his first term and Secretary of State in his second one. Although Rice had not sought the vice presidency due to being a policy maker and not a politician, note the difference is that a policy maker doesn't run for office and do political BS, but you sometimes have to put up with it. Anyway, Rice would definitely be a game-change selection as she was broadly popular with the American public, and although she held some mixed social views, she was a hardcore conservative on various issues as well as the Second Amendment. Her main problem was mostly discussing the economy with the Great Recession and not other social and domestic issues. Lieberman, although a game-changer selection which would rival Obama's rising star status, would turn off too many conservatives in crucial swing states that would make the gamble too risky. Ridge was a solid pick for vice president and could make things more competitive, but was not seen as much of a game-changer candidate which McCain needed to rival Obama. Also Rice, which definitely would be that game change that McCain needed, but she wasn't really a politician and would have trouble debating the financial issues of 2008, which was a big deal. So every one of these alternative options had their pros and cons, but either way, all three of them would be better than Palin. In this alternate timeline, McCain will select one of these three potential running mates, which will put him in a much better position compared to our timeline. Also, McCain will not say that the fundamentals of the economy were still strong during the onset of the Great Recession. He will also make a pledge to be only a one-term president to put the U.S. back on track as a mediator to his old age despite his massive levels of experience. But to further produce a McCain victory, I feel like Obama just must lose the nomination to Hillary Clinton. John McCain has now won the 2008 U.S. presidential election. Yay, and is now the oldest president, being elected at the age of 72 years old. But what's his term now going to be like? On the domestic front, McCain has to face the Great Recession, and in the grand scheme of things, I personally don't see McCain doing too much different than Obama in ending the recession. Perhaps there's a little less government intervention and fewer bailouts, but overall I feel like he would do pretty similar actions to Obama. McCain stated in his campaign that he wanted to select Chuck Hagel as his Secretary of State, which is quite an interesting choice as McCain and Hagel had some differences regarding foreign policy, as McCain was a hardcore neoconservative, while Hagel was a bit more reserved, and this would play out interestingly in his foreign policy. As a side note, Chuck Hagel and his brother were believed to be the only pair of brothers to be in the same platoon during the Vietnam War. Turning to foreign affairs, where there will be some major changes. Starting with the withdrawal from Iraq, John McCain had been a major supporter of the troop surge during the war, which had been very politically unpopular, but was very successful in ending the Iraqi Civil War, and it took politicians who opposed the surge several years to admit its success. Anyway, one key piece of the withdrawal was where the Obama administration chose to withdraw all American combat troops from Iraq by 2011, following Bush's U.S.-Iraq Status of Force Agreement. However, the lack of American troops in Iraq to put down the remaining radical insurgents led to ISIS rising and the 2013 to 2017 war in Iraq. So in this alternate timeline, I feel like the McCain administration would maintain a larger American presence in Iraq following the end of the 2003 to 2011 Iraq War. And although this stance would be significantly unpopular, his administration would be able to defeat ISIS when they were a lot smaller. The 2013 to 2017 war in Iraq likely wouldn't happen in the same way that it happened in our timeline, which has two major political implications. One being that the Iraqi army doesn't fall like a paper tiger, so the corruption in the country is still present, and two being that Iran doesn't gain near as much influence as they did in Iraq in our timeline. It's possible, on the other hand, that McCain's administration would be able to apply even more pressure on Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to stop his sectarianization policies, which pushed many former insurgents who had reconciled with the Iraqi government and fought for them to go to even further extremist groups like ISIS. So with McCain, the situation in Iraq is considerably on better terms, and ISIS doesn't become near as big. However, there's a trade-off there, as the existing government has more corruption. When it comes to the war in Afghanistan, I feel like in the grand scheme of things, very little would change with McCain compared to Obama, as although McCain would likely send more forces into the country in a similar fashion to the troop surge which occurred in Afghanistan under Obama in our timeline, but here McCain would have a lot more boots on the ground to try to limit the number of Taliban and terror attacks, but the real changes would likely occur after the 2012 election, which I'll pick up on later. Bin Laden would also be killed during Operation Neptune Spear, just like in our timeline. which would boost McCain's approval ratings and his handling on the War on Terror. Now on that subject, it's time to turn to the 2011 Arab Spring. President McCain would undoubtedly increase American support for the Arab Spring to kind of repeat what the Bush administration had achieved with the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. Anyway, when Libya and Syria descend into civil wars like in our timeline, McCain would send an immediate American intervention by means of air support to back anti-regime forces. He would be met with instant backlash from many politicians in the U.S. who oppose opening up new areas of operations in the War on Terror, but the interventions are still going to occur, which probably sees some rebel factions deposing Assad in late 2012, but the aftermath will be the next administration's problem. When it comes to Iran, McCain was pretty hawkish against Iran's nuclear and uranium programs, as well as the totalitarian regime of the Ayatollah in general. He was a huge supporter of the People's Mujahideen of Iran, or MEK, which is a left-wing militant opposition group against the Ayatollah. I feel like in this alternate timeline, McCain would provide more support to the MEK and go harder on sanctions while also using deterrence and threats to make sure that Iran doesn't enrich uranium. But no, I don't think he would bomb Tehran or start a war. However, he would enact airstrikes in Iraq, Syria, and Libya against Iranian proxies. Turning to Latin America, McCain favored normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba, even if Fidel or Raul Castro was in charge. In this timeline, McCain is able to do so without there being allegations of him being a communist supporter due to his Vietnam War experience. However, due to his time as a POW, I believe that McCain would be able to close down Guantanamo Bay's torture program in 2009. McCain would also enact more actions against Mexican drug cartels and their ties to Iranian proxies like Hezbollah, as well as support the Mexican government's operations against cartels. Regarding Russian revisionism, President McCain will probably have a pretty hostile relationship with Russia during his administration. You see, McCain had been hawkish towards Russia pretty much ever since the Second Chechen War. He also strongly criticized the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, as well as Russia's actions in gaining influence in states like Ukraine. Anyway, my point is that John McCain isn't going to get along with Russia at all in this alternate timeline, and the feeling was mutual as Putin really despised McCain. For example, after meeting Putin for the first time, McCain said that the only thing he saw in Putin's eyes were the letters K, G, and B. Also, when filmmaker Oliver Stone was doing the Putin Interviews documentary, Putin's body language showed visible anger when the name McCain was mentioned, and he would even clench his fist at the mere mention of John McCain. In this alternate timeline, Russia will be supporting Assad in the shorter Syrian civil war, which McCain then uses to apply sanctions against Russia. It's possible that Russia enhances its revisionist stances, and McCain has strong reactions from the U.S. point of view, as NATO is on the defensive due to the 2008 Georgian War. Meanwhile, Russia probably sees the Georgia War as their defensive line being drawn in the ground. However, the impacts of all of this are pretty unknown, other than the fact that Russia is going to get a huge international smack in the face for the 2008 Georgia War. McCain would also probably become the first president to provide lethal military aid to Ukraine instead of Trump in 2019. It's no secret that during the war in Afghanistan, Iran and Russia provided armaments and financial support to the Taliban. With McCain as the president, the United States would undoubtedly go harsher on Russia for this. Also, during the years of 2008 to 2012 in Afghanistan, there were suspiciously high numbers of Chechen fighters fighting for the Taliban, and if you don't know, Chechens were basically proxies for the Russians at this point. Overall, McCain's term in office sees the recession in relatively the same state. Guantanamo Bay's torture program ended, no large-scale ISIS rise, and instead the group is a low-level insurgency. Syria's civil war ends in late 2012, potentially, and U.S. airstrikes against Iranian proxies occur in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Normalization of relations with Cuba occurs, as well as harder policies on cartels. Additionally, there will be heightened tensions between NATO and Russia as a result of the Georgian War and over Russia's expanding influence in Ukraine. Neoconservatism also remains the dominant faction of the Republican Party for the time being, but on to the next election. 2012 is going to go Obama, as since a condition for McCain winning 2008 was for Hillary Clinton to be nominated. Obama would easily win the nomination in 2012 and defeat Mitt Romney or some other Republican in the election. Obama's term will see the fallout of the end of the Syrian civil war, and at the time that I'm making this video, we don't fully know the impacts of that as Assad has fallen in 2024. But in this timeline, the war was a lot shorter. Also, Obama will have to deal with the paper tiger in Iraq and a revisionist Russia that is eyeballing Crimea, but had been previously deterred under McCain's term. Russia's future will also depend on how Obama handles the situation. In his post-presidency, John McCain would advocate for some form of American retaliation against Russia for placing bounties on the heads of American soldiers in Afghanistan, which is something that happened in our timeline under Obama's second term. Also, this timeline would produce an alternate Donald Trump. You see, Trump's politics changed all over the course of his life, from being a Reagan Republican to a Perot enthusiast Reform Party member, to Clinton-style Democrat to Tea Party Republican, at a time when he was an independent and eventually a MAGA Republican. Trump only changed from Democrat to Republican in the 2000s because Hillary lost the Democrat nomination and Trump greatly disliked the Obama administration. So I feel like in this alternate timeline, Trump is a Democrat for 4 more years until Obama wins in 2012, which changes whether or not Trump runs in 2016 potentially, and it might impact whether or not he even becomes president. But that is just one scenario. What do you think would have happened if John McCain won the 2008 U.S. presidential election? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.